Well, Walter and I are in the habit of me talking first because it's being hosted on our Copperay Community Church Zoom account, but I think is the early kind of getting acquainted time revealed. Most of you, more of you know Walter than know me, and but Chris Miller and I are the two pastors at Copperay Community Church. We had the privilege of, for a time anyway, being Walter's pastor while he still lived in the flyover states, and we are. I am grateful and honored that Walter kept in touch with me, and on the occasion of uh, of the George Floyd. Well, for years now we've been in touch. I've seen Devin play volleyball and be pretty ferocious at volleyball, and I've seen Walter raise lots of leaders all around the country. So if you're familiar with my friend Walter Hill, you know where his heart is. And cool thing tonight is that one of those leaders is one of his sons, Devin, and the other is William Harrison White, who is or William White Jr., who is our other presenter. I'll let Walter, you take it over from here, and let's begin.
Thank you, Dan the Man. Well, thanks. Glad everyone could make it tonight, and it is a special night since we have some young guys that are going to tear our hearts out and educate us on some really good topics and give us great examples. One of the things I just want to cover and talk a little bit about, if everyone know, and some of you were on the Zoom last week when we covered the movie 13 and we had discussions, and it was very interesting, and everyone gave a lot of good comments, and it was a very interesting session. Lots of popcorn, like everybody said, they had imaginary popcorn and drinks, but it was a very good session where we learned a lot about history and some of the things that happened in history. But before that, I have a little short video that I wanted to show, but I also just wanted to make sure everyone is a little bit conscious of looking at the eyes of the individuals in the video, which I thought was amazing with the expressions that were made and based on what they were talking about and everything like that. But this video is first is a short, it's just about 2 minutes, and it's talking about the bias. Again, the subject that we're talking about is more cognitive bias. The subject that's going to happen tonight is unconscious bias, and they're going to blend some other biases into there. But before that happens, let's go through this little short video and give me some feedback after you see it. Okay?
Do you know what you think you know? Whether you're getting into an argument on Facebook or trying to remember that one article you read, these common cognitive biases may be messing with you. Here are a few of the important biases. Number 1, the fundamental attribution error. Move over, The Secret. This error makes us embrace the Western idea of karma in a bad way. We tend to judge the actions of others based on their core qualities, like their personality or character, and we tend to judge our own actions based on the situation. For example, if Sally is late to class, she's lazy. If you're late to class, you were just having a bad morning, right? It can make understanding each other a little bit more difficult. Number 2, belief bias. Whether you're a scientific-minded person or religious, it's really important to watch out for belief bias. You're more likely to believe an argument based on whether or not you believe the conclusion, regardless of the strength of the argument. Number 3, the Google effect. Do you think you've been forgetting more stuff lately? It's not just you. Researchers have been studying something commonly referred to as digital amnesia, or the phenomenon where we tend to forget what's easily looked up in search engines. When was the last time you remembered that actor in that one movie without looking it up? Number 4, backfire effect. Have you ever had an argument with someone online and successfully proven them wrong, but instead of bringing them to the light, the person doubles down on their belief? That's called the backfire effect, when disproving evidence sometimes confirms beliefs. We found 46 other cognitive biases you should look out for. Learn more with our infographic.
Well, thanks, Chris, for showing that. Did anyone, I don't know about me, but I thought it was pretty funny, the expressions in the eyes of the people that were on the video. So I thought it was pretty funny. So that's why I say if you focused on that, their expressions told you a lot through their eyes, even more than what they were saying and what they were believing in. So it's kind of like it was almost like that in the beginning. So I thought it was interesting. Anyone else notice anything in that?
Is there a creepy puppet in there?
Yeah, and did you see the eyes on the,
Just
the
really
puppet?
creepy.
It was just amazing, just the eye contact and the way the eyes are moving when the people are like, yeah, I don't believe that, and the eyes are moving. So I thought it was really interesting and about the cognitive side, but then also the expressions that people make when you watch the video and everything like that. So if anybody else had any comments about that, you're welcome to do it now. I'm going to move on. Okay, that sounds like a no. So first off, also I want to say that we have two dynamic speakers tonight, and they spent a bunch of time doing a lot of research and really on these subjects, and just going to really give us a good presentation on how these go. And first is Devin, and Devin Hill's my son, known the guy a long time. Hopefully he's up to the build and he'll do a good job. And William, talked to these guys all week about doing this presentation, and Williams worked all week too and getting ready for college and stuff like that. And just wanted to welcome these guys and hopefully they could start this presentation. So I'll welcome them and you can get started, and they'll start out with their talk. Thanks. And we'll mute out our mics now.
Okay. Hi, I'm William White, and so we're going to start with unconscious bias. Next slide. Okay, so here we have just a few types of unconscious bias. So we have confirmation bias, which is searching for evidence to back up first impressions. Beauty bias, judging people based on how they look. Attribution bias, how we perceive the actions of others. Affinity bias, hiring people the same as ourselves. Conformity bias, changing opinions to conform with the group. Horns effect, negative assumptions cloud our judgment. Halo effect, perceived as having more positive traits than others. So here with unconscious bias, okay, so here I describe what unconscious bias is. So unconscious biases are social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside their own conscious awareness. So here are three of types of unconscious bias that I thought were super important. And so I have the halo effect, sometimes called the halo error, is the tendency for positive impressions of a person to reflect positively or influence one's judgment or opinion in other areas. For example, when reading a prospective candidate for a job, you may see that they went to a particular university, and this may influence your opinions positively when looking at other areas, especially those that they may fall down on. And then we have the horns effect, which is essentially the opposite of the halo effect. It is an unconscious bias which causes the perception of an individual to be unfairly influenced by a single negative trait. For example, if an individual uses a particular phrase that we don't like, we may subsequently begin disliking a lot of things they say as a result. And the last one is conformity bias, is the tendency to behave similarly to other members in a group, even if it contradicts our own opinion or judgment. And I think that last one's a big one, especially in today's society, of just really trying to fit in with the crowd and not really going against the wave. And then this is just some stats I found. So this is showing on the bias. So 88% of white people had a pro-white or anti-black implicit bias. 83% of heterosexuals showed an implicit bias in favor of straight people over gays and lesbians. And then this is based off minorities. So 48% of blacks showed a pro-white or anti-black bias. 36% of Arab Muslims showed an anti-Muslim bias. And then 38% of gays and lesbians showed a bias in favor of straight people over gays and lesbians. And so I wanted to ask the group this question, and it was, where do unconscious bias thoughts stem from? Where do unconscious bias thoughts stem from? And anyone can talk right now.
I think part of it is, just not where you grew up, but what you grew up around and what you've known,
Mhm.
I was going to say also the same thing in that I grew up in Virginia. And so a lot of what I thought was normal was really not normal. I was taught to conform and not taught to question because no one else questioned either. So I had to overcome a lot of bias that I didn't even understand. That it was kind of infused into my brain, and I didn't know why.
And I kind of think, William, a lot of stuff is programmed earlier in our lives that we don't question because that's what the norm is, or that's what we think is normal. But I also think that it's a lot of things are unconscious because we accept it, and we accept maybe because we've been shown by someone that we respect that think they're right. So we just accept it, and then we get older and it's kind of just the way it is, but we don't question it.
Yeah, and oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say is when we come to that acceptance, then everything we see falls right into that. And it just reinforces it over because we have these cognitive thoughts that go so quickly that we just process over it and it just gets reinforced by what we experience.
I was just going to say that I think also the media, whatever you watch, can create your biases as well too, and that's at an early age, depending on what your parents have you watch, or when you grow up, what your friends have you watch. So that could create your biases.
Stephen, and I was going to say too, I think you can, with media, you can even take some of the age stuff out of it, and not to get too political too quick here, but I think about my own dad, who I love like crazy, but very much watches Fox News. And I have watched my dad's beliefs be very much shaped by that. Beliefs that were different than the ones I was taught growing up, at least on certain issues and attitudes towards those issues. I've watched a shift there. And I really think a lot of it has to do with that constant input.
I agree.
And I always just think, going back to all the things that we've been going through over the last month or two, how it relates to some of the things that are going on with the biases, even with the marching, even with the pandemic and things like that. And some of the conversations I had before now is like looking at some of the things where it's just like anything, we're visual and you judge, and it's a bias because you judge because you visualize something that you might have had an experience, or you might have heard something. And sometimes with, it's just like same thing I look at. You have a bunch of people that are dressed real nice marching who don't get bothered at all. Then people just from the neighborhood marching and they think they're going to tear it up. But they just have a bias thinking because of the way they look, kind of what the video was talking about.
But you know what the interesting thing is too, we're talking about racial bias too. I'm in the restaurant business and I've been in it for almost 30 years. And there's a lot of biases too. And some of it's racial and some of it's other things, but you kind of judge your customers based upon those biases sometimes, or you don't necessarily should. And a lot of times you're proven wrong by it, but it still exists in that business.
I want to touch on a couple of points. One, you mentioned about being in restaurants, and one of the things I heard just talking to friends is that it's biased that African American or blacks do not tip well when they go to restaurants. And as far as media, when you hear news on the media, they always reflect or speak about it. If you're non-white, they say your race. If you're Caucasian, they don't say what it is. So you kind of find out, you kind of know what they're talking about. If they say, well, for example, if somebody was assaulted, if they don't put a race behind it, then you know it's Caucasian primary that did it.
When I thought about this question, I felt like I look back at where do I find like I've had unconscious biases in my life. And I feel like growing up, it was normal for kids in high school and middle school to use language like homophobic language, just as a way to kind of fit in. It was like a comedy, but I never identified with myself as somebody that was homophobic. But so I think that was an unconscious bias that when I really look at it, it's almost to me a way to protect your ego of like, this person's different than me, so it makes me feel insecure because I'm thinking, are they a threat to my own way I live, or, you know what I'm saying, my own comfortability. So I think that's, to me, where a lot of it comes from, is trying to protect your ego in a way, unconsciously.
I think it comes from just not understanding, because I grew up in a pretty racist home. I don't think they were bad people. That's how they were raised. But when I went to school and I made friends, all of a sudden I was like, I don't understand why my parents and grandparents are saying those things. So I think the unconscious bias comes from just not experienced people, even gays and lesbians, until I had a friend who was gay. I just really didn't even think about it. It just seemed like, everybody was talking about just calling them names, and it didn't seem weird. And then I met a real person, and then I was like, oh, wait a minute, this is a real person. This isn't a group somewhere out there. And I think that helps with our unconscious bias, gets helped by actually meeting real people that are in those circumstances.
Yeah, I really agree with that. Like talking to my grandparents about a lot of the stuff that's been happening, they've been watching Fox News too. And so when I try to engage them in conversation, a lot of times they'll say something, I'm like, that just isn't true because of this. Or they'll make a generalization about a group of people, and I'm like, that's not like this whole anti-Islam thing. They're being called a danger to America or whatever. And I'm like, that's an unconstitutional argument because we have religious freedom. But if you're not thinking, if you don't know people who are Muslim, or you don't think in that way, then you just automatically kind of listen to what people are telling you. But if you actually engage with Muslim people, they're generally pretty nice, at least the ones that I know. That's being able to see a group of people as an actual group of people and listen when they're talking is another thing. Because it's a lot easier to listen to somebody you trust's opinion of a person than it is to actually listen to that person. But it's also a lot easier to hate a person when you don't listen to what they have to say.
And it seems like that this is something that happens due to our lack of exposure to people who are different from us. If we don't ever know someone that's really different, or that we, identify as different, however that is, we don't get to personalize that information or understand it or connect with it. So we're all just living in our own little bubble.
Yeah. Before I knew people, I worked with a couple women who are Muslim, and they bought me a Christmas present every year. And right after 9/11, one of their daughters was walking across a parking lot, and she worked where I worked, but she was walking across the parking lot, and somebody drove through and was hassling her. And she was 16 years old, and, she had the head coverings, and it made me so crazy angry that, a feeling that I probably have more often than I should, but I just was so angry that was going on with her. And I think it's because I knew her. And before I would have been upset and I would think that was wrong. But I really was like, you are when somebody attacks your child, you're like, I must go stop that person now. And I do think that it happens from actually knowing a real life person that's experiencing that trauma.
Which, to the point of where you live in the context you grow up in that you made earlier, I think that they go hand in hand. If you live in a sparsely populated or more, ethnically or all sorts of categorically homogeneous area, you meet fewer people who are different, so you don't meet as many, or get to have to experience people more differently. And you know, in the same way, I've lived in Germany, and I kind of, to get news outside of the American bubble, I sometimes listen to German news. And you know, what I notice there is what I notice here, is that in the rural areas, or in the less areas where people don't meet people of other races, or in this case, you know, other religions like Islam, there's just a higher degree of nationalism and anti-foreigner hate, of racism, and I think that's not nearly so bad. I mean, there's pockets of really anger and evil there, but the exposure to more of God's children who are different than you, I think, makes you see the God in the children of God that you see better.
Yeah, I think all those things really hit the topic. Some things that I came up with and that I found are that many researchers suggest that unconscious bias occurs automatically as the brain makes quick judgments based on past experience and background. As a result of unconscious bias, certain people benefit over other people are penalized. Although we all have biases, many unconscious biases tend to be exhibited toward minority groups based on factors such as class, gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, nationality, religious beliefs, age, disability, and more. And I also came up with how media affects through like subliminal messages. So media heavily influences how the public views certain minority groups. An example of this is Blacks appearing in movies as thugs or ignorant individuals that seem to lack intelligence. Sometimes it's not even about race. Many Hollywood movies make the evildoers have a Russian accent as a form of subliminal messaging to our brains, making us perceive people with Russian accents negatively. And then this is what unconscious bias holds individuals back from. So having an unconscious bias creates barriers to inclusion, performance, engagement, and ultimately innovation. Unconscious bias in the workplace can skew talent and performance reviews, affecting who gets hired, promoted, and developed. These biases cause us to make decisions in favor of one group to detriment of others. Scores of studies document how unconscious bias affects workplace decisions. A study by Queensland University found that blonde women's salaries are 7% higher than women who are brunettes or redheads. The National Bureau of Economic Research found that for every 1% increase in a woman's body mass, there was a 0.6% decrease in family income. A Duke University study found that mature-faced women had a career advantage over baby-faced people with large round eyes, high eyebrows, and small chin. And so this graph it goes over the racial disparities and stops, arrests, and conducted by the Ferguson Police Department. Between 2012 and 2014, African Americans presented 2/3 of the population in Ferguson, so it's 67%, but represented a much higher percentage of those stopped and arrested. 85% of people subject to a vehicle stop were African American, and 93% of people arrested in Ferguson were African American. And then I think, is this you, Devin? Devin?
My bad. Yeah, so how can we identify our own use of unconscious bias? So one really cool little exercise that I saw a company use was the team leader developed an affinity building game called We Are More Alike Than Not. And hold on, let me move this. And in the game, Chambers shared sayings like this one from Iran: "Trust in God, but tie your camel." She then asked her participants to decipher the lesson and come up with an American saying that conveys the same meaning. Participants realized this message sends the same lesson as the old saying, "God helps those who help themselves." As participants from different cultures went through this exercise, they became increasingly aware of how similar they all were, despite expressing ideas in different ways. This exercise led to their subconscious generating greater feelings of affinity and connection with people otherwise deemed different from them. And so what was really cool is I found a video online. It was a TED Talk that asked the audience, the speaker asked the audience to really close their eyes and visualize this little situation. So if you guys don't mind doing a quick little visualization, I'll just walk you through it. It'll take like 2 minutes. Okay, so everybody close their eyes real quick. And now everybody visualize this situation right here. So somebody goes out, I go out to dinner and I see a couple across from me that is celebrating their anniversary. The next day, I go on to a flight and I'm running late to my flight. As soon as I get onto my plane, the pilot steps out and says hello to me. The same day, I get to my hotel and then I go to a conference that a huge CEO of a huge corporation is going to be speaking at. And now I sit in the very front row and the CEO begins to speak. Now everybody can open your eyes now. And so first question is, when I said that couple that was eating across from me, most people wouldn't think of two men celebrating their anniversary. In the second scenario, when the pilot came out to say hello to me when I'm late for my flight, most people would not visualize that person as that pilot to be a black pilot. They would usually think it was a white pilot. And in the last example, the CEO speaking in front of all those people, most people wouldn't identify or visualize that CEO as a woman. They would usually identify it as a white man. So it's interesting to think about. I don't know if that will remain true to all of you, but I definitely could say that I think that there's more unconscious bias within us than we really realize sometimes, just in our own imaginations. So how can we go about unlearning these unconscious biases? And I feel like that's a question to the whole group. I'll just say that there's a couple little illustrations here. So does this mean we're prejudiced? Yes. If we consciously agree with what our unconscious mind reveals, but if we are aware of our bias, we can deal with them. So anyone can take that test on the line. It's a pretty interesting little test that Harvard did. And then this other image is just underline the fact that perception and responding to this perception can create change. So that's just a question for all of you. Like, what are ideas that you guys have about how we can go about unlearning these unconscious biases? Do you have any ideas?
Well, one of the things that I've been working on is when I come to a snap judgment, to take a step back and try to figure out what my snap judgment was about versus just moving forward with it, because we're so used to it in unconscious bias, we just don't even think because our cognitive perceptions are so fast. So it's just thinking about our judgments. At least that's how I'm trying to approach it.
I feel that a lot of it has to do with like the next generation. So a lot of it goes down to like when we are parents, or if you do have like a younger generation like that you're like teaching, or you're just even around like younger kids, it's important to like really not have like biased thoughts towards like one group of people, and really teaching them to accept people for who they are.
I just wanted to say one thing too, and ask this question. Do you think the police brutality is a bias? Do you think they're making a judgment based on their experience or their visualizing if someone might do them harm, so they use the excuse of they're trying to protect themselves, or they felt like they were at harm? Do you think that's the same kind of situation that happens also, Devin?
I think that it's interesting because, and I have some friends that are like, my friend Logan has actually just got put onto the Scottsdale fire department right now. He just got accepted to that. But so, and I have a lot of different people in our friends in law enforcement, and I think it's interesting because on one hand, it's like these people, these biases are really used to protect themselves, whether it be from actual violence, a perceived threat to their actual human body, or to their ego in terms of, oh, I don't know if I should trust this person just because I know what kind of people these are. And so I think that there's a fine line, because when I talk to these people that are in law enforcement, a lot of times their basic response would be that they're going to do, if they see things that they perceive to be threatening, then they're going to do everything they can to protect themselves. So it's interesting because it's obvious that there's unconscious biases for police officers just based off of poverty. You go to somebody that if you pull somebody over that is really wealthy, a lot of times they're not going to be worried about they're not going to have to resort to violence because they have other ways of being able to go about that type of situation. They can pay whatever. And so automatically I feel like police officers will go into situations where there is potential for, you know what I'm saying, there's potential for violence just based off of what they're taught in the system. So I think it's a fine line between understanding your unconscious bias and protecting yourself as a police officer. So I don't really know how to change. I think the whole system needs to change, but it's at a point right now where it would be ridiculous to say, take the guns away, because there's so many guns, in America already. In England, they haven't had guns for for a long time. So it makes more sense why the police are able to go around without weapons. So in terms of how we can go about changing that bias in the police force, I don't really know how you can.
Devin, I think that part of that, I'm sorry, is there anything else?
No, go ahead.
I think part of that is this movement to, it's called defunding the police, but that's probably the wrong term. It's about allowing the police to have support people who understand, the dynamics, the socio-economic dynamics of some situations that put them in a place that they can't really deal with it except with violence. And, I think in the medical community, we're hearing and reading so many stories about how all the medical people are working so hard to save the lives of every race, of all kinds of people from every economic level. I mean, I think that's an area right now that we can relate to and say, oh, I don't expect there's any unconscious bias there. Every life to healthcare providers on the front line is important. So that's kind of the attitude I think that we all have to embrace, is that all lives are important, and the medical community really seems to be able to demonstrate that, certainly right now.
Well, I was just going to say, Patricia, the other thing that I think of is similar to what the police, or what Valerie was saying, taking a breath, or thinking first, taking a second to think about it, or counting to 5, because then you can actually come back to reality, because our eyes don't always tell us the whole story. And sometimes things are done visually. They're as an African-American man, and I'm sure other people know this, is where no matter how you look, you could be judged by how you look before you even open your mouth. So sometimes you got to give people a chance and not react on what you see so fast. And I think the police sometimes react on their experience. Like we said earlier, the media, it could be all the different things in their experiences, and they're reacting real quick because of that, rather than giving a chance to just take a deep breath, do their thing, but not go further without kind of taking a deep breath and counting to 5. And I think Valerie kind of mentioned that too.
Yeah. Well, and I want to bounce something, just what Devin had said as well, is the fact that unfortunately our police get reinforced messages from other areas as well. So even though their personal experience, they're dealing with a fraternity of people who see themselves against the world half the time. So they're already walking in with a bias. And it is, right, out of defense. out of, just the fact that the world is against them because they're bad or just found some bad apples. So they're already in a biased state of being defensive. Then you add them in armor. And now you've got a mental thing that says I have to be armored up to go against people. I have to go against people. I have to march against people. And now you're going to reinforce that even more. So these people are being shaped by the fact that you're being trained in a specific way. You're already fearful because you're not equipped properly to diffuse a situation. And then you're armored up with guns, as if you're like an army having to defend yourself. So it's almost sad because they're being made that way on top of that. So whatever's there already is getting reinforced over and over again by the messages of the world. And it's a hard place to be.
I noticed that with like when I would talk to like a police officer about this, because when I went to the march, I went and talked to police officers, and a lot of them were saying like, and it's crazy how fine the line is when it comes to not playing off of any type of bias while being a police officer in this type of like in the realm of police work today, because I feel like they were telling me in times where if they were to count to 5, they would have died. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And so it's like an interesting balance. But and then you look at a situation where that black man was in the parking or in a drive-through at McDonald's and was running away, and they shoot him in the back. So it's like it makes you wonder, okay, are people using these unconscious biases as an excuse to basically have whatever their will is to execute their will? So that's where I think it gets tricky.
Yeah,
I wonder
something about retraining.
That's right.
That's interesting is if you look at the mental health community, my mom worked with mentally handicapped adults for a long time, and you have to learn how to de-escalate situations nonviolently. And of course it's different, but like there's a lot to be said for like being able to approach a situation in a calming way versus an aggressive way. And like if you come at someone with a gun versus if you come at someone with like, your facial expression, how you talk to someone, how you hold yourself. Like mom was talking about the power imbalance in the relationship, because you have more power than the other person and you have to be aware of that. And like letting the other person, like something about police brutality specifically is like it's not always unprovoked, obviously. But so often it goes so far past, or like the person didn't even have a weapon or this, that, or the other thing, where it's like, if the training was different, and like also if there was more leniency given to the victims in those situations, to the civilians, because like if you're truly there to keep the peace, right? Like you should be able to learn how to peacefully de-escalate violence as opposed to adding to it. And like there are lots of people whose jobs it is to do those types of things. And so like I feel like if we changed our mindset of like how we viewed those situations, not viewing them as a threat and instead viewing them as something to be dealt with. The whole mindset thing.
I think oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say I agree with the young lady that just spoke, and then the other young lady too, about where they're saying to defund the police. I agree with her, because instead of when you call 911 and they send the police for everything, and the police are taught to come with a gun to kill. And so, but if 911 calls, if somebody has mental issues or if it's a dispute, if they had social workers or some other means, some other people to call that are taught and they know how to calm situations down. Because if the police come, they have the gun and they come to kill. And everybody keeps saying that to train them more, but it's just kind of, being African American, and then you see, well, they act differently if it's not an African American. So they are trained on people that don't look like them. They treat them differently. But if we had an avenue where we had more people available to come to different, I mean, if it's a robbery or something like that, that's totally different. But they send the police for everything, and they come with a gun. And there's social workers. They get trained. They have all kinds of education. Whereas the police, not that they're not trained, but they go for their training for however long it takes them, 90 days or whatever. And then they give them a gun and they teach them to use the gun. They're not teaching them the social skills and how to deal with people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think when you get into a moment where the adrenaline is super high like that, you fall back on your subconscious thinking. I mean, you are acting in the moment and you fall back on what you subconsciously think. And so I think what happens is a lot of those officers have these biases as they go into it. And then they get into a situation where they are just falling back on those and not consciously thinking through each decision. And you see those biases turn deadly.
Well, and also like going back to the social worker thing, right? Like, it's kind of ridiculous that police come to every 911 call, you know, like
Right.
There's stuff that police shouldn't have to deal with. Like, one person shouldn't have to cover the wide range of stuff. If my car broke down and I call 911, like, I don't need police there, you know, or like this, that, and the other thing. Like, it's also building situations for violence. Like, it's just making more opportunities where there doesn't need to be any. Like, if it gets to the point where I feel more comfortable calling a friend to come help me than calling law enforcement or calling the people who are supposed to be able to help, like, I feel like our system's a little bit broken at that point.
You know, and the other thing we have to take into consideration is we're all human. What's our motive for becoming a policeman in the first place? I have a distant relative who just wanted to hold a gun and be in control and tell somebody what to do, which is the worst case scenario, but they let him be a police officer because he went to a small town that didn't have the level of scrutiny that maybe a large city might have, and then he can transfer to a large city because he was a police officer with experience, which absolutely frightens me. Right there, you've got people who like to just pistol whip people. It's an exertion of power, right? So, but they're human. They all exist in every realm, but it just so happens they have a gun, right? And I think that's what makes it even more alarming. Is it's one thing to be a person with our personal motives and all the things, but it's back to, we ask for a certain level of standard because you have something that could defeat us all, right? And I don't.
Something like psychological studies, right? What people are drawn to law enforcement, right? It's the people who want to have power. It's the people who want to be in those situations. Like, you can train them all you want and stuff, but if they want to be holding a gun, right? They're not going to be watched all the time, right? If they want to be able to boss people around just for the fun of it. I've been hearing stories of like people who like have gone on ride-alongs with police that are friends of theirs or stuff like that. And it's just like, yeah, they just cruise around neighborhoods looking for trouble sometimes when stuff is slow. Like, you get people who are just they're like bored, or they're looking for some fun, and that fun is in subjugating other people. Of course you're going to get violent situations. Of course you're going to get stuff where people overreact because that's what they want to do. Not that all people in law enforcement are like that, obviously, but it's just like, statistically, the people drawn to those positions tend to have that predisposition.
I think you have to change the culture. So if you work in a company, we've probably all worked in a company that was toxic and a company that was not toxic. So right now I work for Procter & Gamble, and it is just crazy how different culture it is. And I'm always like shocked, but every single week we get an email from our CEO of the total company talking to us about biases and racial discrimination, and they, you know, they are boycotting Facebook, which is freaking out all of our stores because they want to, you know, post on Facebook, but they're like, no, we have morals. And if you are harassing anyone of any kind, there's just no tolerance for it. Someone turns you in and you're fired. So I think what that takes is, and I think that goes across everything in a business, you know, you have to create the culture. So in the police department, in the hospitals, and the, you know, emergency waiting rooms, and in the, you know, the clothing stores where you walk in and people follow you because they think you're going to steal. You have to, as a supervisor, whatever that would be, whether you're, you know, the police chief or whatever, it's the culture that you create, and you create a no tolerance culture, and this stops. And we can create all the laws we want, but honestly, the sad thing is, what happens is the lawsuits. Companies don't want to get sued. So as a female, I know when I first started working, I was harassed all the time, but I'm never harassed now because the company has set up no harassment because they're afraid of the multi-million-dollar lawsuits that they're going to get if someone harasses me. So I think it's just figuring out, you know, what should the culture be, and, you know, changing people in the police department. It is not acceptable to be that person. And if I'm another police officer, it's safe for me to say, no, you can't do that. And I'm not sure in a lot of companies, I know in companies I've worked for, it wasn't safe to say that. And I'm sure in the police department, I mean, we saw that with these people who were on the job a week and their trainers showing them this is what you do. How do they speak up? It has to be a culture where it's okay to speak up.
You know, we're in a culture too where those police officers are policing where everybody has a gun, and maybe a more powerful gun than the one they carry. So I think that creates a lot of fear that adds to cloud their judgment when they're out there trying to police.
Plus we give them dummies and pieces of paper that tell them to shoot right through the heart every time. So that's your natural instinct.
I mean, also like talking about like training and what they tolerate, right? First of all, if you know, somebody has a history of being violent, they should be fired from any job, but they aren't in police often. And then also the techniques they use for detainment are often inhumane. Like the throat hold, right, that killed George Floyd is like a thing that's taught to police, which it should not be, right? Like there are other ways to make sure somebody's incapacitated that don't block their airways, right? Like that doesn't feel like is the best option, but they use it anyway. And, you know, there are plenty of others, like using tear gas on protesters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Like these are not individuals making choices. These are systemic things that people are being taught, right? Like it may not be one bad police officer, one person with a propensity for violence, when everybody is told this is what you do in this situation.
So yeah, and also I think it's important too. Like I talked to my friend Kale, who's in the Navy out in South Carolina, but he was telling me that I was telling him about the unconscious bias and how I was going to be talking about it, and he was telling me that the military is actually putting them through monthly classes pertaining to unconscious bias. And it's interesting because I feel like when you look at the military, police system, anything with a real black and white structure, it takes the longest for those type of structures to kind of implement new ideas. For example, like gay people in the military, and then women in the military. So it's like they're always kind of a step behind, but it's cool to see that they're at least creating the platform to be better in terms of, you know what I'm saying? But I thought that was interesting because I think it's really important. But and the last thing we really just wanted to mention was the concept of explicit bias, and it refers to the attitudes and beliefs we have about a person or group on a conscious level. Much of the time, these biases and their expression arise as a direct result of perceived threat. And so, as opposed to implicit bias, these are biases that we are conscious that we carry and use them to protect us, either physically or our way of life. So, for example, back in the day when they would have signs that say whites only, that was explicit bias. And why is it's important to understand these biases because people are more likely to express their explicit biases when they perceive an individual or group to be a threat to their well-being. Research has shown that white people are more likely to express anti-Muslim prejudice when they perceive national security to be at risk, and express more negative attitudes towards Asian Americans when they perceive an economic threat. When people perceive their bias to be valid, they are more likely to justify unfair treatment or even violence. This unfair treatment can have long-term negative impacts on its victims' physical and mental health. And even the people that carry these explicit biases are negatively affected because, like Will was talking about earlier, it voids them the opportunity to learn, to grow as a person, make new connections, and to experience more life through everyone around them. And then so this is things that we could do about it. So expressions of explicit bias, discrimination, hate speech, etc., occur as the result of deliberate thought. Thus they can be consciously regulated. People are more motivated to control their biases if there are social norms in place that dictate which prejudice is not socially acceptable. As we start forming our basis at an early age, it is important that we reinforce norms in our homes, schools, and in the media that promote respect for one's own and other groups. Research shows that emphasizing a common group identity, such as "we are all Americans," can help reduce interracial tensions that may arise between majority and minority ethnic groups in the U.S. Also, we conduct under the right conditions. Studies show intergroup contact between people of different races can increase trust and reduce the anxiety that underlies bias. But what I thought about that was kind of interesting about this is how it talked about how research shows that emphasizing a common group identity, such as "we are all Americans," can help reduce interracial tensions. But if you look at what was happening with all lives matter, that wasn't really the case because it was kind of negating the actual message of the movement itself. But I just wanted to see what you guys thought about that.
Well, I think that's another divisive thing that we're dealing with. All lives matter, Black Lives Matter. There's a lot of people who are very not understanding of the issues here because they want to think that we're all one big happy family that live together in harmony, and we're not.
Yeah, there was this really nice talk I watched about how just because we've made steps forward doesn't mean racism has decreased. It's just gotten sneakier. Like this guy wrote a book. I need to find the talk again. It was really good, but he wrote a book. I think he was talking about the Obama administration and how racism, like how it enabled Trump to be elected because like the people who were racist, right, had to repress it and be quiet about it for those 4 years. And then Trump comes along and he never says anything like, "I don't like Black people," but he says a lot of stuff about let's make it great again. Well, what hasn't America been led by a white person? You know, like it's very like this coded language that it's like the people who are listening for it, the people with those unconscious biases hear it and they don't even process it sometimes. They're just like, "Oh yeah, I didn't like that one guy. Huh, maybe I need to think about it this way. Huh, maybe I need to look at it this way." And like when you get diversity in the media, right? I'm really into watching TV right now because we're on lockdown. And I've been thinking about like in TV shows, right? There are Black characters, but they often die really soon, or they aren't like a leading role, or like the gay character gets reduced to being a stereotype, or they don't get to be in a happy relationship while the straight character does, right? Like there are these things that's like, yes, we've made steps forward, but we have to make sure that we don't accept that as enough, right? Like just because we are more accepting does not mean that we are not still experiencing hate crimes, or not still like, you know, we have to still keep fighting for those things to change instead of just like get the lip service to cover for it.
And I think that one really important thing to go about that change really quick is just like you were talking about earlier about how a cop walks up to somebody with a gun, they're not going to be really like, they're not going to really visualize very many positive outcomes. So it's important to realize when we have a conversation about somebody or with somebody that might have an unconscious bias, not to come out with a gun, like a gun in terms of our own language. It's to try to communicate with them in a way that you can connect with them and show, you know what I'm saying? Because if you come at them negative, like, hey, you're a racist, you're this, you're just hatefully, they're not going to want to change anything. They're going to want to protect themselves. And, you know what I'm saying? So I think that's important to also do.
Well, and that was in the video that Walter showed too, wasn't it, Devin? That if you you never win an argument by being right. I mean, you never change behavior by being right. You change behavior by, you know, speaking softly and building a relationship, and then kind of, in Christian terms, the scales fall off their eyes.
So this is the last question that we came up with, and that's, where do you see explicit bias?
In your own lives.
Anyone?
I mean, well, like, here's an example. My grandparents are they're not pro-Trump, but they're very anti-Biden. And so grandma saw one ad that Biden put out that was pro-Muslim, right? He's like, we need the Muslim vote. And she's like, that's so dangerous. We can't empower the Muslims. Look at what they're doing in other places. And I'm like, Grandma, we've got Muslims here. Like she actively, like, she literally said, I can't believe you would be like defending a group who wants to kill other people based on what they believe in. And I'm like, Grandma, do you remember the KKK? Like, this isn't a religion issue, right? Like when you're fearing these violent groups of people. But yeah, like that's an explicit bias that I saw, but it was explicit because she had been told it, right? She's been so fed this narrative. She volunteers to help out international students from Nepal who come to UMKC, and a lot of them are Hindi or Muslims. And so she knows a lot of those people, but she still has this bias because of the news and the things that she takes in. So it's like this weird push-pull dynamic. But like once I explained it, like once I pared it down to those terms, I'm like, Grandma, Christians have been just as violent as you claim the Muslims are being. We don't need to separate, like we don't need to separate people based on religion. We can separate them based on their actions. That kind of blew her mind.
You didn't do that coughing. Crusades.
Right, right. What was the Spanish Inquisition?
Yeah, I think you get the same thing when you talk about political parties. You know, if you're this, you must be all of that, and you must believe everything of that. And I just don't always think that's the right way to think, because everybody's different. You might like 30% of that, but doesn't mean you like 100%. You think everybody in a group thinks the same. But that's the way our society is sometimes. You get tagged, and then it's bias against you because you belong or you believe that, but you never say you believe it all. And I think that sometimes that happens also.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we, in the video earlier, it talked about how sometimes it can be a certain phrase. And we live in such a culture of phrases, of hashtags, that I find myself guilty of hearing somebody state one of them that I don't agree with and assuming their entire character is bad. Like right now, I mean, if I see somebody online that says all lives matter, I'm like, oh, God, I'm done with them. It's over. And I have to stop and realize they're more than just that statement. I may not agree with that statement, but there is more to that person than that, and even more to their saying that than that. But it's hard because we live in a Make America Great. We live in a all lives, Black lives. We live in hashtags.
And cancel culture.
And
and we just, oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to ask about Sarah and the community ambassadors. Does that work?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure?
No. So my husband, just in our conversations that we've had about, my husband's very much more a solutions based, like what can we do type of, and just in talking about racial issues, one of his friends had posted on Facebook, who works in downtown Kansas City. He works for the city, and had posted an article about these community ambassadors, and within that he said something about they can like calm down 90% of nonviolent situations. So I guess one would assume, I guess they're working, but I mean, I'm not there to witness it.
We have that here, Walter, in Ventura. They have the ambassadors downtown, and also they've started here, and I think also in Santa Barbara, starting to send out social workers with police when they know it's a situation that has like mental illness or something like that involved, and then they, you know, have the social worker go along. And it seems to be working out really well. And they're a lot less confrontational meetings because of that.
Walter, have you encountered situations where they don't work?
No, I think you sometimes in those situations, if they're not trained well, you get the same thing where you get a power struggle, you get power. And when they can patrol the neighborhoods, I mean, it's almost the same thing where I grew up, where there was gangs in the neighborhood. You still get the same thing. Sometimes they mean well, and sometimes they mean themselves to get in a lot of power. And then, you know, power kind of corrupts. So there's a balance and basically training. So, you know, that's all my experience.
Yeah, it all comes down to motive. You know, it's interesting because all we have to do is watch the television to see explicit bias, people picketing with people against other people, white supremacy out there. Everything is, we could just have to watch the television and we see explicit bias just by people gathering together to yell at another group. Whether it's political, whether it's based on color, whether it's based on gender, or lack of, we see it all the time with people holding their signs, yelling at lines. It's all over the place.
William,
it's purposeful.
One of my biases as a pastor is that I like to hear my own voice, but I notice that there's a couple of silent observers here. I see Tim Johnson. I see, Neil, Fred. We got a few more minutes left. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I definitely wanted to chime in on the explicit bias part, and more of a social setting. I saw a video recently where it was kind of a little experiment done, but it was a group of, you know, white guys just walking down the street, having a good time, and, you know, nothing happens. Everybody's going about their day. Bystanders aren't, you know, concerned or worried. But then the same thing happened with a group of African Americans, and you start to see like people slowly cross the street if they're on the same side of the street as them, or of course people clutching their belongings, whatever it may be. And also the group of black men were stopped by police, just questioned, what are you guys up to exactly, things like that. But it's a bias that, you know, is on black people, that we are seen as dangerous or untrustworthy or uncivilized, whatever it may be. But in reality, we're just the same as everybody else. We like to hang out with our friends, have a good time with each other, enjoy each other's company. But that's just a bias that I notice is portrayed on black people.
That also happens in the workplace as well. If you have a group of Caucasian people having a conversation, could be talking about work or just general conversation, people just generally walk by. And I can use myself an example. Being a African American and talking to other African Americans that work for me, but you have another person stop and say, "What are you guys talking about?" As opposed to just walk by like anybody else.
I also have a similar situation in the workplace. This is when I was working at a former bank that I used to work at. But of course, we have dress policies, dress professional, things like that. And this particular day, I came to work in a suit, button-up shirt. Everything was freshly pressed, ironed, right? And I thought I was pretty professional, had on a suit. I didn't have on a tie, but apparently I had one button undone that showed a little bit of a small chain that I was wearing that my mom gave me. I like to have my mom with me everywhere I go. And then the next day, email went out about the dress code because one of the CEOs was actually in my office that day. And it just so happened to be like my second or third week on the job. And I just felt like there are too many coincidences for that. And I've seen, coworkers come in with sometimes a polo and like not jeans, but pants. And they considered that professional. And I thought dressing in a suit was professional, but I guess everybody has their own opinion.
So Tim, what was it? Was it the gold chain? Was it the one button?
It was a small silver chain.
And that was it. Okay.
I had it buttoned, but it was just one button undone that showed a glimpse of it. Yeah.
So no jewelry to be worn by men, is that it?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll admit that's a sign of my privilege. Until you said there were too many coincidences, that never dawned on me. I'm like, oh, that's bad timing.
Mm-hmm.
Because I haven't had to be the object of that sort of suspicion or derision, or I mean, they deride me for other things, but not my race or gender. So any others that would like to speak up maybe and share something that haven't had a chance?
I just wanted to say the example that was given about I think Tim, you gave it about coming across maybe 4 black men walking together or 4 white men. I've had a situation because I walk my dog a lot downtown where I live, and I've been walking where there's 4 they're young adults, white men. I have more fear of that. And the reason I have more fear of that is because none of them made an effort to move over to let me go through on the sidewalk. I was the one who had to move over. But not only that, I think I have a fear of that they have it's a feeling that they have entitlement. So I don't know if that's reverse discrimination, but that's my fear. I have more fear of a group of white men who may be having a good time and being rowdy because of that, my perception of that there's an entitlement there and that they can get away with a lot more. And that scares me.
Yeah, I definitely have a bias against men and for women just in like people. Like I was picking out classes for JUCO and like all of the classes are the same, right? There are 20 biology courses, but I noticed I was hovering towards the ones with instructors who had feminine sounding names because I'm like, oh, I'll probably like their teaching style better or whatever. And like, I don't know that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know nothing about them, or like I literally don't even see their picture. It's just the little name. And like the fact that that's my, it's just because like women are more reserved and they make me feel safer than men do. And it's like I've had plenty of great male teachers and I have good relationships with men in my life, but I still prefer, like I still have that bias pretty explicitly toward women, because I guess I just feel like I'd relate to them more, I'd be safer around them or whatever. But yeah, I feel that for sure.
So let me ask this question. We talked about bias, but you're actually talking about, in some ways, preference. I mean, we have preferences and biases. There must be some difference. Is there a difference between preference and bias?
I think it's just connotation. Like, preference sounds nicer than
Yeah,
bias does.
Yeah, and I just wanted to share, you know, I was talking to Patricia about this. My friend in Tucson, that's he's a judge, and he was telling me a story, and I was sharing it, I think, with Devin, those guys, about they had a meeting with all the judges in Tucson, and he's in South Tucson. So he went into this room with all the other judges, and when he went in the room, there was all these white older judges, and the judge there, one of them told him to go get him some coffee. And he was like, I'm a judge too, you know, but I thought it was so wild. And he said it was amazing. He said, and some of the other judges laughed because some of them knew he was a judge, but this particular judge didn't know, and he thought he was there to get him coffee. And he just told him, get your own coffee. And by the way, get me a cup while you go, you're getting yours. You know, so I just wanted to share that. I just thought it was amazing that he told me that.
Yeah.
The only thing I wanted to say is I think we all have biases, and I think it's okay to have bias. I don't think it makes you prejudiced just to have a bias. I just think the challenge that we have, like what, you know, when I was growing up, didn't have a lot of experience with Asian culture, and so I had a bias about the Asian culture until I went to MIT, which is very diverse, our Sloan Fellowship experience. So I learned a lot about the Asian culture and the difference between the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, and I had friends from those different countries. So then that really changed my mindset. So then whenever I came back from MIT, I heard the jokes, I was like, it really, you know, rubbed me wrong because I had friends like that. So I think with our biases, the way to change that is to go get experiences with that, whoever you're uncomfortable with or that fear, go get a different experience with that group, and then that's going to help change your bias. So if you're a Democrat and you got to think about Republicans, go spend some time with Republicans. If you had a good friend is Republican, and then you'll address that bias and vice versa. So if you're a white male that has a fear of a black male, go spend some time, you know, get a different experience with that black male, and then that will address your bias, in my opinion.
Amen to that.
Good point.
I want to say, I went to get a massage, and it was a really fancy place, like very official. But I go in there, and then I see one of the masseuses walk out, extremely beautiful lady, very tall, looked like she had nice traps. So I was like, oh wow, I hope that's my masseuse. Then I get my masseuse when I'm done with the paperwork, and it was homosexual African-American man who was also deaf. And so it was definitely, at first I was like, okay, how am I even going to be able to communicate? But then I noticed, I was like, okay, why am I already uncomfortable? I was already uncomfortable even before I went in the room. And then my challenge to myself was, okay, try to go into this experience. It's not like I went in was trying to go pick up a girl anyways, but it was just like I was more comfortable. But me realizing, okay, this is making me uncomfortable, but why? And challenging that instead of running away from it, saying, okay, let me just go into this experience and see, you know, with an open mind.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. Like if you have a fear of being around a homosexual, then go spend some time with, you know, homosexuals, and then it will address that fear. And it's like you have a different experience. Because right now, I think the reason why people have fears because they don't have a good experience of that culture or that group. But you got to go get that experience, and that will change your bias. That will change the way you think and feel about that person or about that group of people.
Right, I want to go off of that. I forget exactly where I heard it, but someone said that maybe, you know, the way to fix racism is if everybody experienced an interracial relationship. Like, do you think that is? I'm not saying it's the way. I'm not saying everybody go date someone, you know, but like somebody because you like who they are, and not just because they're a different race than you. But do you think that's something that, you know, people should experience?
I don't know if you have to go date to get that experience, but just maybe spending some time, like going to dinner or going to the movies or going hanging out playing golf, just spending some time with the interracial couple. I think that will help you address your bias. I don't think you have to necessarily date, but just
Yeah,
spending some
my
time.
wife would not be a fan of that. So,
well, I just want to say I'm a Trekkie, and ever since when I watch Star Trek early, so you know, Fred, that I believe 200 years from now, there's going to be so much blending, it's going to be just one shade, because it's just impossible not to have blending. Like you saw Star Trek when the first episodes, there was a Russian, there was a, if you got the aliens are going to be in another planet, so we're all going to be together. And I think there's going to be a lot of blending, and you barely see someone that says, I am Irish. It's just not probably going to happen when it's a planet. That's what I believe. I believe there'll be so much blending. You very seldom see someone that's one thing and
Yeah,
complete.
that's something I think about a lot, is like why, you know, certain people from certain places are there. It's like, I live in a white neighborhood. Why is that? Well, the houses here are more expensive. If you walk 2 blocks that way, there are a lot more people of color because it's cheaper. Not because people of color can't afford houses, but, you know, like redlining and stuff. I think my neighborhood has J.C. Nichols' name on it, and he's a racist and contributed to a lot of the redlining. But anyway, like looking around your neighborhood and thinking, if you go into a room and you see it's one group of people, ask yourself why. Because like my thing was like, I'm a white girl, right? I had never really felt like I experienced sexism. Like I never really felt like I felt it. But then I took a music production class at JUCO, the college, the community college here. And I walked in the room and there were only 2 girls, including me, in the class. And that was the first time I was like, that's the first time I'd been in a group that was that much not like me. And I still had a great time, and I was like one of the top 3 kids in the class, and like, you know, loved the instructor, going back for the next semester. But it's like, why aren't there more girls, right? I go to an open mic at the Nelson Atkins Museum, and it's a free teen open mic once a month for kids 13 to 19. And so you get like poetry and like stand-up routines and songs and whatever. And that room is the most diverse place I've ever been. You get all sexualities, you get all colors, you get all different like you get everybody there, right? Especially because it's in the city. But then I went to another open mic at the Rhino, which is in North Kansas City. And I walked in and it was almost all white men. And I was like, why is it that when I go to the Nelson for an open mic, I see half and half girls and guys and a really even distribution of color? Whereas when I go to this other location, it's almost all white men. Like I think the 2 or 3 nights that I went and performed, I was either the only or the second girl to perform out of the whole night. Like, why is that? You know, because I know other girls are interested in music, right? I know other girls are writing music. I know Black people are writing music, right? But like, why aren't they there? Like, that's just something to think about, you know?
You know, a number of you, Taya, you included, have done a nice job of illustrating how the bias, implicit and explicit, that Devin and Walter have been teaching us about, you know, is broader than just race. And so I've learned a lot, obviously from you, Devin and William, but also from the other comments around here. I do want to acknowledge, though, that according to my clock anyway, it's 9:28 Central. We try to be done between 9:15 and 9:30. So with that, I would just like to turn it back to our two hosts, letting you know we don't have a firm choice for 2 weeks from now on the third Thursday for our topic. Suggestions have been African Americans or race and sports. And what was the other one, Walter, that you had named?
Education.
And education.
And then we've talked a lot about the police tonight. So
So
that's
the
also a
kind of
good subject.
sidecar. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, we want to honor everybody's time because we're certainly grateful. There are a couple of folks maybe that are here, if not for the first time. You haven't been here too many times. We want you to have a good experience and knowing you can get off without awkwardness when it's over. So, Devin and William, any final words for us?
Thank you. I hope, I learned from all of y'all, but hopefully the conversation itself was beneficial in some way. Thanks.
You guys were awesome.
William, any closing words from you?
Thank you.
No, thank you for everyone for tuning in with us. Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Good job.
Thank you.
Well done. Thank
Good
you.
job.
William. Good job, Devin.
Thank you so much.
So we'll be back 2 weeks, and I'll be we'll be posting another what's going to be the topic. But if anyone has any suggestions, they could post something in the comments over there, and we'll grab them. So before you log off, if you want to post topics, any suggestions, we're open to listen to those. And thank you.
Thanks, Walter. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks,
Fred,
Devin.
Fred, I
Thanks,
just have
William.
to.
Hi, Mom. Hi, Shabbos.
Good night.
Bias.
Good night.
I forgot to